Björn Holmberg. I'm the director of the Challenges Forum International Secretariat, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar. You might be online everywhere, all over the world. So I'm happy that you made it. I know that us in the Western Hemisphere are having a very early morning, and I know some of our poor panelists are actually up late in the night, but I'm happy that you are all here. The title of this webinar is How Can A4P Be a Catalyst? And just to tell you a couple of words before we enter into the specific subject. The Challenges Forum, for you that haven't heard of it before and joined our webinar, is basically a network of 50 partners in 23 countries that strive towards making peace operations more effective or efficient. That means both political missions, special envoys, and of course peacekeeping, which is our biggest area of work. And all our work is basically done through our partnership. And the partnership is really global. It spans from west to east and south to north, including the permanent members of the UN Security Council, but also basically all key contributors of troops and police to UN peacekeeping operations. But we also look, of course, on peacekeeping and peace missions of regional organizations. So that's the wide span that we have. We have started since last year a series of webinars, and the idea of these webinars is really to increase our reach and to create more platforms for dialogue, because that's really the spirit of the Challenges Forum. By being a platform for different views and opinions and ideas, we hope really to create thrust to improving peace operations. And meeting, you know, has a huge environmental impact. So as a second purpose, we also thought that doing more webinars, also aside from making us meet more frequently and discuss different topics and make proposals, it also helps us to decrease the environmental footprint. So you're really welcome to contribute to both of those purposes by attending today. I wanted to say a couple of words before I'm going to hand over to the moderator, because we have such an esteemed panel today, and I'll let our moderator introduce them. But last year, the partnership adopted the strategy for 2019 to 2023, which basically outlines two strategic objectives where we would like to influence. And one is of having an effective development and reform of UN peace operations, but also regional partners. The second is to improve mission leadership, especially senior leadership, and also, of course, middle management, but primarily senior leadership. In the strategy, we also have an agreement among the partnership, as you heard, spanning the globe, and that is also to contribute to more gender-responsive peace operations. So that is part of our principles and approaches as a partnership, and that's why we thought it was really important to gather this webinar to look at how can Action for Peacekeeping, the initiative by the UN Secretary General Guterres since March 2018, help us improve gender equality, but also further the women, peace and security agenda. Having said so, I'll just give you some words on the running order. We will start out with the panelists, and I'll just hand over to our moderator in a couple of seconds. And that will be more or less 1 hour. We will also have a Q&A session, because most of you are actually participating, watching a video stream. But you can already, during the first part of the session, you can pose questions, and the Secretariat, the Challenges Forum Secretariat will look at these questions and post them to the panelists when we open up the second part of the webinar. If you would like to ask a specific question to a specific person in the panel, please put the name down so we can direct it to that person. I would also like to say that I'm really happy. As you see, I'm seated here at PKSI in the US with Ryan here on my side. So he will accompany me during the webinar, and hopefully I see that the two of us will put a better weight on the gender balance in the webinar, which I think is great. So you can rest assured that we will, of course, also contribute. So aside from saying that, I would just like to hand over to Maria Bedford, who is our senior officer at the Secretariat, that has courageously taken on this role to be the moderator today. So really happy for that, Maria. So I'll just hand over to you, and let's kick off the webinar. And welcome to everyone.
Thank you, Björn. Well, I'm very glad to be here, and I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished panel for this webinar. So with us here today, we have from New York, Ms. Njoki Kinyanjui, who's Chief of Gender Unit and Senior Gender Advisor at the UNDPO. Welcome, Njoki.
Thank you.
We also have Challengers Forum Senior Advisor and Head of the International Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Ms. Lisa Sharland. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Maria. It's good to be here.
And unfortunately, Mr. Fabrice Ramadan from Folke Bernadotte Academy had to cancel his participation with short notice, as he got sick with the flu, so he didn't have a voice this morning. But instead, we are very pleased to have one of his colleagues and the head of the Women, Gender and Youth program at Folke Bernadotte Academy, Ms. Gabriela Elroy, with us instead in his place. So thank you, Gabriela, to stepping in on so short notice.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I would like to start this webinar off with saying that commitments have been made by member states to implement the WPS agenda. And the topic of today's webinar is how A4P can be a catalyst to bring about change in order to meet the commitments made. So just to remind you about the recommendations that are included here, is the collection and use of gender disaggregated data, the increase of participation of women in peace operation, and to integrate gender advice across peace operations. So my first question I would like to address to you, Njoki. How can A4P advance the WPS agenda within the context of peace operation, and in what way would you say?
Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are. I just want first to take off from where Björn said that the A4P agenda is a Secretary General's initiative, and which was put in place in 2018, in March 2018, and basically to collectively address the challenges of peacekeeping. And within this agenda, there are commitments signed by 151 member states, and also 4 regional organizations, as well as deep commitments from the Secretariat in terms of addressing the challenges of peacekeeping and ensuring that peacekeeping becomes effective in addressing the contextual conflict settings where we are working, which are quite complex. And therefore prioritizes a couple of things which are set out in a framework. And within this, one of the core priorities is addressing the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And the reason why I look at this as an instrument of framework that prioritizes and elevates women, peace and security is because women's peace and security is looked at as a political imperative. It is within the framework of addressing political solutions and pushing towards having political solutions in the complex nature of conflicts that we have. And therefore tries to reframe women, peace and security away from a technical agenda to a political agenda, which is linked to addressing the political challenges. And I think this is huge because it looks at women, peace and security as part of the solution, as central to the solution. And in terms of looking at it as catalytic, I would look at 4 things. One, within that framework and within the prioritization of women, peace and security, I think it centralizes the agenda. It is not a sideshow. It is a central agenda to addressing the challenges of peacekeeping. And therefore moves away from dotting the papers with women and girls everywhere to looking at what are the critical things that we can do within the women, peace and security agenda to address the challenges, of which one, as Maria has mentioned, is looking at how do we enhance the effective participation of women in peace and political solutions. And this is the centerpiece of Women, Peace and Security agenda in terms of looking at women as capable, looking at women as part of the solution, and actually confirming that we cannot have peace processes, we cannot have sustainable peace without the meaningful participation of women. And not just representation, is looking at how do we centralize the voice and agency of women in all decision-making processes, right from the gendered conflict analysis, right from identifying the priorities, identifying the core mandates, identifying the core priorities, looking at governance and institutional frameworks and all decision-making processes, including stabilization, security arrangements, DDR, SSR, where you bring central the women, peace and security agenda. And in that agenda, actually elevate the fact that bringing women's participation as core to that is a game changer and is transformative, and women are change agents. So that is one. The second one is also, bringing core to the fact that you have to ensure that the policies, plans, and initiatives are gender responsive, and thereby looking at internally within the missions and ensuring that a gender perspective is applied right from a strategic assessment to set up the mission all the way to the transitioning of the mission. How do we look at that in terms of ensuring that every part of the mission pulls the weight from a gender responsive point of view? And in this, we have introduced, including accountability measures and tools and indicators and dashboards where we track on a regular basis how missions are integrating gender and women, peace and security into their core functions and components. And of course, the third one is women in peacekeeping. And the fact that increasing women in peacekeeping is critical from the civilian, police and military, from the uniformed and the civilian as perspectives. Therefore, it brings that agenda central and coalesces it around trackable and measurable indicators that we can track on a day-to-day basis, and some of them in real time to ensure that the A4P agenda is from a women, peace and security agenda is trackable. I think the other third thing in terms of how the A4P agenda catalyzes the implementation of women, peace and security is also the fact that apart from looking at the WPS agenda as a core priority, it is also how we integrate the WPS agenda across the other components of the A4P agenda, integrating WPS into protection and looking at how that impacts on the protection of civilians. Looking at partnerships, how do we ensure that the WPS agenda is core in the partnerships that we develop, whether it is partnerships with academia, whether it's partnerships with all the stakeholders of women, peace and security. And critical to this is one of the key changes that the Department of Peace Operations did since 2017 is looking at women's organizations as partners, not consulting them, but looking at how do we ensure within our policy frameworks, within our operations frameworks, that women are partners, women's organizations, women leaders are partners, and not just women at the national level. We have a deep dive in looking at how do we ensure that the local women's organizations are part of the process, and looking at the challenges and the barriers of linking local women's organizations to the national process, including in performance in the sustaining peace agenda. That's another. And finally, I would say that because the framework is clear, it makes it trackable. and measurable. And as you know, what is not measured will not be done. So we have 15 core indicators that we have introduced in this framework where we are tracking the implementation of the WPS agenda. And every quarter we produce both qualitative and quantitative data that shows progress, that shows where we are stagnating, where we have gap areas, and where we need to do more. So in essence, what I would like to say is that the A4P agenda centralizes the WPS agenda and makes it substantive and part of the political imperative of the Department of Peace Operations. Over.
Thank you, Njoki, for your very good points there. Lisa, I'm going to hand over to you. You would like to say a few words?
Thanks very much, Maria. And can I start by saying thank you to the Challengers Partnership, I think, for holding this webinar at a particularly timely opportunity when we are talking about it being 20 years since the adoption of the first Security Council resolution on women, peace and security, which I think in many ways has really brought about the discussions that we're having around the agenda today. And we know, for instance, that the adoption of that first resolution followed many, many years and decades of civil society engagement and political advocacy around a number of the issues that we see reflected in the now 10 Security Council resolutions on that, and many of them having just been referred to in terms of the work of peacekeeping, but more broadly, women's participation in political processes, their role in conflict prevention, the importance of looking at their protection, integrating gender perspectives and so on. And I think it's also important that this is being looked at in the context of peace operations, as we have heard from Secretary General's reports that there is pushback in some of these areas and concerns about the progress that has actually been made over the last 2 decades, whether there is a need, I think, to defend some of that as well. And I think we see this reflected in some of the discussions that we have around peace operations. So I don't have too much to, I guess, build on some of what's already been said in terms of action for peacekeeping and to the extent that it's a catalyst for women, peace and security. But I would like to make the point, I think that we can see it as a catalyst in the way that member states and different organisations engage. So firstly, in particular, the role of the host country that's hosting a peace operation. A number of the areas where a peacekeeping mission might be engaged, particularly when it comes to influencing the participation of women in political processes and the role of the international community through the Security Council and advocating for women's participation in those processes is really key. And similarly, I think in the security sector, when we're talking about reform and increased women's participation, you know, we have conversations about to what extent does increasing women's participation in the peace operation also perhaps act as a role model or a catalyst for women in the host country where a mission is deployed. So certainly in terms of the host country, I think there is a real opportunity there for some of the aspects that we do expect member states to take forward on women, peace and security to be further progressed through peace operations. The second point I would make is around, I think, the contributors themselves. So troop and police contributing countries. We have just had a very brief discussion about the efforts to, I think, incentivise the participation of more women, particularly when it comes to the military and police. So to what extent, I think, you know, there was a really important discussion there around how A4P can catalyse some of those expectations around women's participation in the security sector when it comes to troop and police contributing countries. And I think the third point I'd make is also within the UN itself, in the way that it seeks out gender equality and gender parity, in the way that it tries to ensure that women are put into leadership posts in UN peace operations. There is a real opportunity here as well, I think. So in those sort of, I guess, 3 stakeholder areas, I think there's a real opportunity when it comes to how action for peacekeeping, I think, can catalyse some of those efforts that have been pursued through women, peace and security, particularly over the last 2 years. There are many more, and I'm sure that's going to come up more in the discussion, but they're just a few reflections.
Thank you, Lisa. You mentioned the police and military increase of women in women's participation in police and military. How do you think member state can bring about this change and can increase women participation in uniformed professions?
Look, I think that's a number of countries at the moment have been attempting to address that for a number of years and certainly over a number of decades. I think, you know, there are a lot of lessons still to be learned. We know, for instance, that the ELSI initiative that is being looked at through peace operations is certainly trying to look at that in the context of peace operations specifically. But I think a lot of it has to go to, I know organisations, for instance, the approach of the Australian Defence Force, and I'm speaking from Australia, you know, has looked at issues around how do you retain women in defence and ensure that they stay in the organisation? How do you make that more suitable for them? How do you look at recruitment? What are some of the barriers to their participation in the organisation that haven't been overcome? Whether it comes down to issues such as, on the, I guess, the more technical side that some would see, around benefits, around childcare, but also in terms of access to the different roles that are available. And we know that different countries are at different sort of levels of progress along the spectrum of what roles they open up to women in participating in these organisations as well. And that is something that I think needs to be continued to sort of be looked at. But this is also particularly critical in the context of peace operations, of course, as you've alluded to. Because if those barriers aren't addressed, if those roles aren't opened up to women by member states, then we're not going to see women sort of coming down that pipeline to actually serve in peace operations. So there is a real, I think, incentive there for the UN as an organisation to make sure that it is engaging with member states about addressing some of those barriers to women's participation in the military and security sector.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. You mentioned this role of women, and I would like to ask Gabriela how you think women's roles in that are deployed in mission. How can you, do you think there are specific roles, and is there like a risk or advantages with certain roles that women have in missions?
Well, thank you, Maria. Well, you're asking a tricky question. If you're asking, do I think that women should have specific roles in peace operations, then I guess my answer to that is no. Even though I do know that the discussion, or there is a strong tendency to quite often get into arguments when we try to advocate for why we need to increase a number of women in peacekeeping. There is definitely a tendency that we put forward arguments that would suggest that women, you know, would serve specific purposes in peace operations. And I would say like this, while I can sympathize and I understand where these arguments come from, they are quite common, and there are definitely, we know that there have been short-term gains in sort of giving concrete examples of where women in peacekeeping can make a difference, because that's ultimately what it very usually, you know, usually it comes down to: how can women contribute to peacekeeping? That's sort of the underlying question there. But in that question, you know, we don't think about it often because we are quite used to hearing it and we are very used to arguing for it. But there is an underlying bias that we tend often not to see. And I think maybe most clearly that bias is, you know, become visual when, you know, we ask ourselves, how often do we ask the question, you know, what do men actually contribute to peacekeeping? What are their specific roles in peacekeeping? And I do think that, you know, as it's not to say, I mean, this is a balance with always when we talk about these issues, I tend to say we need to be able to keep different, you know, things in the air at the same time. And it's not necessarily black and white. And we do know that women, because of social roles and And because of, you know, experience and different perspectives, they may bring different experiences into peacekeeping. So it's not to say that, you know, there is no added value, but I think the first question to ask, or the first thing to state, is simply that, you know, it is a matter of rights, and it's a matter of gender equality, and that's the principle. And if there is added value, that's exactly what it is. It's added value. And to remember that when we ask about, you know, if women, when we pose that women are good at certain things, indirectly in that statement is always also that women are less good at other things, supposedly that men are better. And given that peacekeeping has been, you know, conducted for many years with a very high underrepresentation of women, we can also assume that roles that are said to be, you know, good for women are probably not considered to be the most essential ones. So there are a lot of, you know, there are a lot of problems when we talk about women's participation, and specifically when we do indicate that women have specific contributions to make. But of course, if you ask me if I think that it's important to have women in peacekeeping, absolutely yes. If I do, you know, if you ask me if I think that it's important to have women participating on equal terms with men in peacekeeping and peace operations, of course, yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Gabriela. Yeah, my question was a bit unclear, but I was referring actually to the remarks of the Secretary General that he'd said in the Security Council on Women Peacekeeping last year that women at Checkpoint has been credited with promoting less confrontational atmosphere, and more women in peace operation is credited with higher reporting of sexual and gender-based violence and lower incidences of sexual exploitation and abuse. You already mentioned this, Gabriela, but do you think there is a risk of these statements? Does it put like pressure on women?
Yes, well, who am I to go against the Secretary General? But I do think, let's put it like this, I do think that these kinds of statements, we need to, you know, we need to make them with caution, for sure. We also know from research, actually, that there are a lot of assumptions. I mean, we assume a lot of things. I think that, you know, we assume that women are, you know, good in peacekeeping because they're good at engaging with the community, local community. I think that's a quite widespread assumption, but we do have research that actually shows that while that might be true, we know very little about it, because actually peacekeepers don't necessarily engage enough with local community, whether they are males or females. We also know that female peacekeepers are sometimes, you know, having less mobility because of also gendered preconceptions of needed to be protected and not being allowed to be out there. So what I would say is, I mean, we also know, of course, that in certain situations, yes, like the checkpoint, because of how women are perceived, we do know that sometimes that can contribute to sort of de-escalating a situation. We know that. So again, we must be able to say, you know, one thing, but looking at it maybe a little bit critically, and also think about, you know, what does it actually mean? I think the argument with women actually contributing to decreasing sexual exploitation and abuse, I think, you know, has another layer of you know, it comes with another layer where you have to also we have to ask ourselves, is it fair to expect female colleagues to be sort of the moral police of their male colleagues? And moreover, again, Sabrina Karim, who has done a lot of research and who is now connected to the ELSI report, you know, has done research that shows that that is actually not correct, but what does decrease sexual exploitation and abuse is values of gender equality. That is, you know, what we can see to have an impact. So gender equality, yes, but maybe not, you know, to attribute that to women's participation or number of women in a mission.
Thank you, Gabriela. Lisa, I know you made a reference to this point as well in your latest Challenges Forum policy brief on the subject. So I'm going to let you in, and then I'm going to let Njoki as well in on this question. Please go ahead, Lisa.
Thanks, Maria. I would certainly agree, I think, with many of the points that Gabriela has made with regards to, I think at the end of the day, you know, our primary focus is on gender equality in terms of the way that we are going about. And often the discussion around women's participation in peace operations, I think much like the way that gender often gets conflated with only being focused on women, sometimes discussions around women's participation, I guess, get very focused on women as opposed to what really a lot of the time is the goal is you know, the aim of gender equality in the way that peace operations are carried out. I do think there is an inherent risk. And again, I think it comes back to context and emphasis, and we need to be very careful about the way we frame some of these things. But, you know, there is certainly a concern that perhaps if we focus on, you know, and a lot of the evidence, quite rightly, in some of these cases is anecdotal, and there needs to be a lot more investigation into it. But at the same time, when we do highlight some of these experiences, we need to be careful that we aren't pigeonholing women into these types of roles in peace operations, that they're not being instrumentalized. I think those are important things to focus on. The one point I would make, and I think this is where we really have a challenge, and I think it's a broader discussion in women, peace and security, is we do need to focus on, yes, we are aiming towards gender equality. Yes, we want to advocate that this is a rights-based approach. But one of the walls that I think we sometimes come up against in these discussions is the different audiences that we are talking to. And it's quite sad to admit that I think sometimes the focus on those terms isn't enough to convince some people of the benefits of increasing women's participation and ensuring that they have a more substantive role in peace operations. And I think we do need to go that step further sometimes, based on evidence and based on research, to talk about, well, this is the benefit. If you have more women, and at the end of the day, I think we are also talking more broadly about more diversity in the teams that are deploying, and in terms of what that contributes. I think, you know, that adds and enhances benefits to what peace operations can actually carry out on the ground. And so I think it is a very comprehensive discussion that we need to be having. But I think I'm very conscious, particularly sometimes when you're talking to the security community, for instance, that they are very much grounded in, well, how does this affect what's happening on the ground and what we're trying to do at the end of the day? And so I think we need to be having that very comprehensive discussion across all these different pillars when it comes to women, peace and security, to make sure that we are engaging the broadest audience possible, particularly when we're talking about peacekeeping stakeholders and the peacekeeping partnership.
Thank you, Lisa. Njoki, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I, of course, agree with Gabriela and Lisa on many of the issues. But I just want to come in on one issue that sometimes really relegates the WPS agenda to numbers. It's just the conflation of representation versus participation. Because in most cases, when we are having a discussion on participation of women, it is basically actually, we are talking about numbers, representation of women in peace operations, and not the actual core issue of ensuring that participation is actually, that we say that representation is a precursor to participation, but participation is what we are aiming at, which is the link to gender equality, where we are looking at how do we articulate the voices and agency of women, how do we ensure the priorities and the capability that women bring on the table is well articulated and part of the process. Because the numbers game has also led us to the rabbit hole of looking at WPS as women being vulnerable, women needing support and help to be part of the process. And I think we just need to reframe this agenda and look at it from a participation point of view in terms of what do we have women making decisions? What are the barriers? What are the historical barriers? What are the gendered norms? What is the exclusion and discrimination of women? And address those root causes. Not unless we address those root causes, then we will still continue having the discussion of we do not have enough women, etc. And look at the areas that we work in peace operations. We are looking at issues to do with the political space. We are looking at governance. We are looking at power relations. We are looking at security arrangements, which traditionally in some of the norms in the context we work in, it's the area of men. So it's really looking at the WPS agenda. And that's why in peacekeeping, we're looking at the WPS agenda within the political space, because that is where transformation can come. Within the political space, you can look at laws, you can look at legislations, you can look at quotas, you can look at all these things that try to have more transformational change. And therefore, just to add on that, because both Lisa and Gabriela have said we need to look at gender equality. But from a WPS point of view, we have the frameworks, we have the language, we have everything. And I think we need to redefine what participation is, because participation has been relegated to just representation and therefore has ended up into a numbers game. And if we reframe it, we need the numbers for participation and focus on crushing those barriers. So that's number one. Number two, I think it's the whole bit of, are we looking at women or are we looking at the systems? Because it's plugging in women into systems that are not open to them. So how do we fix the systems? How do we work on the political systems? How do we work on the security systems? How do we work on the power relations within those systems so that women who are actually ready to be in those processes and can contribute widely into those processes are part of those processes. The third one is that the whole issue of women's role and what they contribute. I think there's a lot of anecdotal information, and that's why projects like ELSI and the DCAF looking at the barriers is important, so that we actually look at those barriers that lead to the exclusion of women. And we need more research in terms of the contribution. I don't think we need to prove, because this world is made of 52% women, so why shouldn't we have women there? We don't even have to prove that. But if we have to build a business case, I think we need more research into that. And I know IPI wants to go into that arena. I know through the ELSI project, a lot of funding is going into the research component, which is critical so that we are able to build a business case. So there is a lot of inference on what women can contribute or not contribute, but we need solid research. So that we don't also go to the way of essentializing women, of instrumentalizing women. And the fourth one, which is my final point, is that it is working on accountability. How do we strengthen accountability? And this is one of the things that we are saying that we are focusing on. Whose agenda is this? And holding the leaders accountable on the implementation of the WPS agenda, having core leadership and the political weight in the national governments, within the UN system, within all the stakeholders, within the Security Council, with the member states, with the TCCs and PCCs. It's much more about accountability. What accountability mechanisms do we have? What are the consequences of not having women, and how do we build on this? I think our key ways to ensure that the WPS agenda becomes more nuanced and it's not just about the numbers. Yeah.
Thank you, Njoki. Gabriela, I think you have something you want to add, so I'll let you in here.
Yes, just a final remark, and I think that, I mean, I want to be clear. I really sympathize, Lisa, when you say, it depends on context. We know that in certain contexts, it is really difficult to get across. It's really difficult to be listened to. And of course, a lot of the arguments that we now, criticize come from, you know, having to motivate, having to justify why. So I definitely sympathize fully with that. But I do also think that, you know, now we are 20 years down of women, peace and security. We have done many more years than that on gender equality in the international arena. Of course, these kinds of arguments have been there for a long time. They are not new. They you know, since the 70s, we've had this sort of instrumental arguments where women have to be good for something else. And I do know that within certain parts of the security world as well, I'm sure that you also are aware, of course, we do start to see the pushback. So we need to also keep in mind that these arguments may be short term and sometimes necessary strategies to even be allowed to you know, be heard. But we also do see that there is a pushback, because of course, when, you know, when the world is not revolutionized because of women being in peacekeeping, or when peacekeeping is not, you know, revolutionized, of course, people will say, well, then what's the point? You told us it would be so much better, but we don't see the results, which of course also puts a burden on women who we know try to actually prove to live up to the expectations that are on them, but also risk, of course, to say that you told us it would be so much better. We don't necessarily see these great results, so we don't have to do it.
Thank you, Gabriela. I mean, we've heard some arguments now from the right-based approach. Even though you agree, you say, Lisa, with Gabriela, based on the instrumentalist approach. But I was wondering, can you see any synergies between these two approaches? Can they support each other in some way? I mean, you said, Lisa, that sometimes you need to change your arguments to make things happen. But what do you think? Can they support each other?
Look, I don't think they're mutually exclusive in terms of what you're arguing. I think you can have both arguments being put forward there in terms of what, at the end of the day, you were trying to achieve. And I certainly appreciate the point being made by Gabriela that perhaps that puts a lot of pressure on, you know, the analysis and research that goes into some of these outcomes. And we have had discussion of the fact that there is quite a bit of anecdotal evidence out there, and there is more research being conducted. But certainly at the moment, I think we need to engage across the broad spectrum of the different issues that we're encountering when we talk about women, peace and security. And a lot of that does focus, when we are talking about peace operations, on what the impact on the ground is. So I don't think the two concepts are mutually exclusive, and I don't think they should be pitted against one another as though they are two opposing camps. In the way that we are looking at women, peace and security. I'm not saying that's what Gabriela was alluding to at all, not at all. But I think we do need to be cognizant that part of what we are trying to do here is convince in some way in our arguments when we talk about, for instance, increasing the participation of women, we are talking more broadly about what that brings to the table. What that brings to the table in terms of diversity of voices, what that brings to the table in terms of the capabilities of an organisation because of that diversity, because of that gender equal, I guess, representation. And really that, I think, is the goal that we are looking to achieve at the end of the day. But I think when part of the challenge that we've got when you look at issues such as women's participation is there has only been incremental progress, particularly when it comes to the uniform component. And even in the case of the civilian component, I think if I'm not mistaken, you know, some of the multidimensional missions, there's been a real challenge in pushing the number of women civilian, the civilian components, women's representation in those multidimensional missions, increasing that as well. So I think part of this is a discussion with different stakeholders about actually looking at the audiences that we are presenting some of this information to. I think it does need to be cautious in terms of relying on, obviously, the evidence that we do have at hand. And at the same time, I think, and I agree with Gabriela on this, it shouldn't be a case that the women then face the burden of having to prove themselves on the ground either. But I think we do need to make sure that we are sort of addressing that broader discussion with the different stakeholders that are engaged in peace operations.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to let Björn in here and see. Björn, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, and thanks for all the important ideas and strong analysis. I was just thinking that, as Njoki said, eventually it is about power relations. It is about politics. And I think what holds us back, and that was also put in Lisa's paper, is that it's eventually about social and concrete structures in the member states that provide troops and police, but also the leaders. And we need to look at also partnerships, as you said, Njoki, with bilaterals, of course, the UN development parts and so on. How can we help, empower change in these countries to make that change? And having done several peace and conflict analysis in many countries with a strong gender lens, I keep getting back to with my team, seeing that it's actually women and men holding back change. Men not being engaged and threatened, and also a lot of women being in traditional roles holding back their daughters, so to say. So it is really a profound change that is necessary. And then I step back and think about what we've done with the Challenges Partnership, because we are, as you heard, 50 partners in 23 countries, and we are increasing in size from all parts of the world. And when the Challenges Forum Secretariat team the last week made an analysis of what are the priorities of our partnership, it was very clear that the WPS agenda is primarily a Western interest within our partnership. So I think Lisa's point of us talking with different audiences is really, really important. And it brings me back to the old battle between the rights-based approach and peace builders. Should you strike a deal with the devil, or should you uphold human rights and go for no amnesty? That we tend sometimes in our theoretical discussion to make one or the other. And I'm happy to see that it seems, I hope, that we actually agree that even though a rights-based approach is the basis, we need, even though we care, also show the benefits of change to those that are still not convinced. And also that is a respectful way of understanding that we have different points of departure. Otherwise, I think it becomes sometimes a risk of being a bit imperialist in a cultural way. So my take would be, and I think you already responded to that, I wanted to ask that, but I would take the position that we need to do both of these things, both primarily the rights-based one, but also sometimes use the instrumental argument to convince and get strengthen the incentive for change. But the question for me then would be not to get stuck on academic arguments and approaches. Is how would you do that? I mean, how can you proceed? How can you really use the A4P to concretely contribute to hopefully structural changes, but minimum a change in the peace operations?
Thank you, Björn. Gabriela, I'm going to let you in here.
Yes, I think to also emphasize, I mean, yes, the rights-based approach, but I think it's not only about principles. I think it's ultimately about the analysis and how you actually see the problem. And I do want to really emphasize that I think first of all that we need to be better at actually operationalizing gender equality to make people understand why gender equality makes sense in the context of a peace operation, which I think is fully possible. So I don't think that, you know, talking about the broader rights-based or, you know, gender equality in a structural way, to take a more structural approach, because that's eventually what it's about. I really do think that it doesn't contradict being able to operationalize and show people how it's concretely relevant. And I mean, ultimately, it's about telling and explaining to people that gender inequalities is going to affect their work, whether they want it or not. So at the end of the day, it's about understanding what gender inequality looks like in a specific context. And that's very concrete. When we talk gender inequality, and of course, women's lack of participation is one of those that we are trying to address. So just so that, you know, I think that just when we speak about, you know, to say, I think we are quite in agreement that there is a need to talk more broadly about gender equality, and to dare to do that. I would really make a call here to say that, you know, we need to have the confidence to actually stand up and say that gender equality in itself is a value. And also believe that we can explain that in a very concrete way, why it's relevant and why that has an operational effect. Because there I would definitely say that, you know, to see gender inequalities and be able to address them has a very concrete operational effect. So in that sense, it doesn't contradict talking about how it actually contributes to mandate implementation and how the organization works.
Thank you. I'm going to close this question now. Moving on to the next question, which I would like to address to Njoki. I mean, the latest Challenges Forum paper on this subject, written by Lisa, argues that member states need to ensure that they strengthen and elevate the position of gender advisors in peace operation. And it also argues that preparing and training military and police personnel to serve as gender advisors within peace operation is critical to secure engagement and support from the military component. So what would you say, Njoki, are the biggest challenges and or opportunities facing gender advisors within missions, and do you think it differentiate between civilian and uniformed advisors?
Thank you. So I completely agree in terms of, you know, having gender advisors is critical and key in peace operations, right from the headquarters to even the smallest missions that we have. And I would also say, and nuance this and say, they have to be at the right level and the right location to be able to influence the implementation of the WPS agenda, to be able to influence policy development, to be able to influence the operational work, to be able to influence all the decision making and the priorities of the mission. So they have to be at the right level and the right location. A couple of years ago, the Department of Peace Operations, which was DPKO before, made a decision to relocate all their senior gender advisors to the offices of the SRSGs and the heads of missions. And why this was done was to bring them to where there is more political weight and where the decisions are made, and to have a clear oversight over the functional components of the mission, but also to be able to take advantage of the good office of the SRSGs, because as we are saying, it's about being able to connect the mission mandates, the implementation with the other stakeholders. And most of the stakeholders, definitely, especially within the political space, are within the confines of, you know, they're dealt with from the office of the SRSGs, heads of missions, through the good office. And so that was critical. And we have seen changes since the gender advisors were moved to the offices of the SRSGs and heads of missions, and being able to be in the senior management meetings, to be able to be in the planning and budget meetings, etc. So the right location and the right level, especially when we have humongous missions where almost everybody who makes a decision is at the director level. It is important to have a senior level gender advisor sitting in that mission and leading the WPS component. So that's one. The second thing we identified is that previously in our policy orientation, The onus to implement the WPS agenda was on the gender advisors, and this had to change. The gender advisors facilitate their experts. They can advise, they can provide guidance, and they can do analysis, they can support the analysis and change and transform the decisions of the missions. So our current policy orientation removed the onus of the accountability on WPS from the gender advisors to the leaders. So it is about the SRSG, it's about the Secretary General, it's about the directors, it's about the obligations for staff. So try to spell what everybody is expected to do, and therefore centralizes the role of the gender advisor as a person who supports the process, who provides advice to the leaders, who helps doing the analysis, who points out all these issues, and also is a key interlocutor with the women's organizations, etc. And then the third thing we identified is that if we are transferring the onus of the WPS agenda away from the technical experts to the leaders, then we needed tools that will help them to make decisions. And therefore, the gender advisors are supporting the implementation and the tracking of the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda through core indicators, through facilitating capacity in the mission, having dialogues with the mission components, and ensuring that these accountability tools help the SRSG, help the Undersecretary General to hold the system accountable in terms of, here is what the indicators are showing, here is the analysis from the indicators. And the third thing is also to invest in gendered conflict analysis, because without gendered conflict analysis, then we cannot plan from an informed point of view. So that has been critical. Then 2 years ago, started also having military and police gender advisors who also support their components, because we saw it was important to also have gender advisors sitting with the military because of the type of the command and control structures and decisions that are made there, as well as the police. However, the civilian, I would just use that loosely, or the leads of the WPS agenda who sit in the SRSG's office or in the USG's office, bring their agenda together. And therefore it's important for all those pieces of components to have technical expertise who sits very close to the decision making within those structures. But the uniformed gender advisors rotate because they are deployed from their mission. Some even rotate as soon as 6 months. And you can imagine in humongous missions such as the integrated and complex missions, within 6 months, I mean, holding the WPS agenda in whichever framework, I think that is one of the challenges, because they rotate very fast. It's good that we still have the civilian gender advisors who are Secretariat staff and who, take the mantle and can put the pieces together. But of course, there's a lot of rotation. I think the second thing is resources. I mean, we do not have enough resources, and therefore this is an area that we need a lot more money into the WPS agenda, into the implementation of the WPS agenda. So we have those resource constraints. And the third thing is that for the Secretariat staff, we get staff allocation through the 5th committee. It has been a huge fight to push to have the gender advisors stay within the missions, and especially in transitioning missions. We have polarized voices within the decision making in the 5th committee, where some member states do not support the WPS agenda and therefore do not support the fact that we have gender advisors in missions. And therefore we are constantly fighting, every 5th committee, we are constantly fighting to have our gender advisors stay at the mission level, including in some cases being asked to justify why we would need to have a WPS expert when the WPS agenda is a development agenda, it's not a peace and security agenda. So I would say that is a big issue. And then of course we have transitions and drawdowns. The gender units are the smallest, and therefore using the prorata of when the transitions and drawdowns are happening, we quickly lose our gender expertise within the missions. And we've been trying to say that we need the gender advisors to stay all the way until the end of the mission, and also to have the seamless transition of the mission, whether it becomes a political mission or whether it is transitioning to the UN country team. How then do we still have the gender expertise in mission until the transition happens? Because we have the realization that also UN women's capacities sometimes are weak in some of the conflict contexts, and therefore we do not have an equal counterpart within the UN country team to transition the WPS gains in the WPS work. So I'll stop there and also hear from the other. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Njoki, for that extensive and informative answer to my question. So to summarize, the gender advisors need to be at the right level, at the right location. The biggest challenges are rotation and resources. I mean, Lisa, I know you did a recent podcast on the subject of gender advisors' role in the military for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where you spoke directly to personnel from the Australian Defence Force that had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and South Sudan. So can you share some of your experience from that podcast? And please, can I tell you to be a bit brief, because we only have a couple of minutes before we're going to get the audience in. So to the audience, before I hand over, I just want to say, please prepare your questions. If you have any, we've started to have questions come in. But please feel free to use the Q&A function in the bottom of the webinar panel. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks, Maria. I'll be as brief as possible. You're quite right. We did just do a podcast, and part of the rationale for undertaking that podcast, I think, was really to share with the wider audiences what the role of a gender advisor is, what they actually do in the field, because I feel there is a lot of misconception about what that role actually entails. And so part of the rationale was to say, well, you know, they might have a role in influencing the planning of an operation by ensuring that, you know, the cultural differences in society and the role of women is factored into the way that military operations are conducted. It might be a role in terms of making sure the right information is being collected. And I will make that point that part of what we need to be doing here is making sure that we're collecting data, that it's gender disaggregated data, and looking at it across a range of different issues, whether it's reporting, whether it's planning, whether it's analysis early on in a mission phase. So that was sort of part of the rationale, and there were different mission contexts as well. So it wasn't just peace operations exclusively. I think many of the points that Njoki's made around budgeting and financing is absolutely critical in terms of making sure there's not a disconnect between the political commitments that are being made by member states and what's actually being implemented in the ground. And I think what was really interesting, just to round up so I'm not taking up too much of the time, was just to go back to that podcast. It was very interesting to reflect specifically on what a military gender advisor had done in the field. We had Wing Commander Angeline Lewis, who had deployed to South Sudan as a military gender advisor, reflecting on what that meant in terms of the military component in the mission. And I think part of the challenge here is making sure that it's not just the responsibility of that gender advisor, and this is being talked about, but that responsibility is shared and that everyone across the mission is held accountable. And I think when that information is shared, when people see the benefits of how that advice, of making sure that data is brought in, that the analysis is undertaken, they then actually see the value of that being included in the work of a peace operation. And I think that's the point that we really need to try to get to.
Thank you, Lisa. With that, I'm actually going to open up the floor to our audience from around the world. So please, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A. And if you want to address them to a specific panelist, please write so. So we have one question here from Ollie. What will be the reasonable time frame to have equal gender participation within reason in peacekeeping? and how is it measured? That's the first question. So I'm going to see if we have a volunteer to answer that. Njoki, do you want to did you hear that question?
No, you're muted. Yes, I saw the question. I'm not sure I can talk about a time frame, 1 year, 2 years, but I just want to say that the biggest challenge that we are having in having deployments is that most of the national militaries either do not have the women, or they just started admitting women recently. And therefore, we were having a conversation with one military advisor, and he said, we are trying as much as we can. We have women in our military, but we just started admitting them recently because of their own policy orientation, and as we said, about gender norms and the traditional outlook of security, and therefore we need to work on that. So I think a lot of work is much more on the source, where in the national militaries, because it's only if the national militaries can deploy women, change their policies, train the women, prepare the women, that we can have gender equal, as the question says, deployments into peacekeeping. So what we are seeing in peacekeeping is a function of what is in the national militaries, and I think that needs to change. And thanks to the LC project and many other projects that are coming in probably, and the awareness that this has brought, then the national militaries are also looking at ways and mechanisms of elevating women within the military and the police. We still have more numbers coming in from the police rather than in the military, and especially within the combat roles. And therefore that is an area that it's not only working on it within peacekeeping, but actually from the source, which is the national militaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Njoki. Does any of the other panelists want to come in on that question, or should I move on to the next? Okay, I will move on. We have here a question from Christine. Thanks for the interesting discussion. I appreciate the focus on leadership's role in being responsible for and drive for gender equality within peacekeeping missions. More concretely, what would you like leadership to do? Can I, Lisa, would you like to have a go at that question?
Thanks, Maria, and thank you very much for the question, Kristen. In terms of, I think, one of the things that I'd point out in terms of what leadership has to do, I think a lot of this has to do around setting the tone and setting culture in the organisation and the people that are being led. Of course, a lot of that is set by the example of the leader. And I think this is reflected in the decisions that they are making around how they are assigning budgets and using them, perhaps where they have the flexibility to do so within a mission, how they are engaging with perhaps a gender advisor in a mission and ensuring that other parts of the team are doing so, how they are ensuring that their team and their staff in the mission are being held accountable for making sure that they're integrating those gender perspectives, that they're collecting the data that they need, that they're engaging with women in civil society and across the mission. So I think a lot of this comes back to both the culture in terms of the mission that the leader is setting, but at the same time how they mirror that in terms of the accountability of the team that they are working with. And of course, for leaders themselves, there has been considerable discussion around, well, how this is considered in terms of compacts with the UN to make sure that the leaders themselves are also being held accountable. But I think, of course, a critical step when we consider the work that is carried out in the field obviously comes to how the leader, whether it's the SRSG or the broader the broader senior mission leadership team, how they actually make sure that that is implemented and actually that their staff working in the mission are held accountable at the end of the day.
Thank you, Lisa. We also have a question here from our partners in Canada. So the Department of Peace Operations Uniform Gender Parity Strategy not only set minimum annual targets for the participation of uniformed women in UN peace operation to 2028, but also presented a significant number of actions to be taken by the UN to create enabling environments, advance communication and outreach, and to support the increased participation of women in military, police, justice and corrections components. Can you please advise what DPO's top priorities are for 2020 to take this work forward, anticipated challenges and what support DPO needs from member states and partners for this strategy to succeed? I'm going to address that question to you, Njoki. Do you want to give that a go?
It's a tall question, a big question. I would say that the Uniform Gender Parity Strategy has targets and incremental targets every year. And so there were targets for 2018, there were targets for 2019, there were targets for 2020, and there has been progression in the implementation of those targets. And also just to reference my previous answer in terms of when I said that we really have, it has to be a huge thrust within peacekeeping and also addressing the environment, and all those things are being done, especially with the support of the LC project, but also a huge thrust in terms of addressing the challenges within the national militaries. I could email a more concrete answer and a more substantive answer later to the person who's asking that question in terms of some of the key things that are to be done in 2020. But for every year we are building on to the successes of the previous year and having incremental initiatives every year to try and meet this. But of course, with the recognition that 2020 is a big year with the 20th anniversary of 1325, and hoping that working through with the TCCs and the PCCs, and especially within the A4P framework, that these targets can be met. Over.
Thank you, Njoki. So Juliet in Canada, you can receive more information by email after the webinar. Moving on to the next question, is from Sama. If we are talking beyond advocating for specific purposes for women in peace operations, how do we utilize women's capabilities, individual ones, in peace operations to ensure the maximum success of mission? And I'm going to address that question to you, Gabriela.
Yes. Good question. I think, in a way, the answer would be just like we, in one way, just like we try to maximize capacity of other individuals in peacekeeping. But I do think that one thing that we need to look at and that we need to talk about more and be aware of is possibly how bias and unconscious gender bias actually may play in the sense that we might not, it might affect and make us not use individual women at their best potential, to their best potential. So, it's a difficult question, but because the answer is in the question in a way. It depends on the individual, it depends on the post. But if we still look at sort of women as individuals, we do know that they very often, or at least sometimes, are facing challenges just because we do have underlying bias of what they are capable of doing and not capable of doing. So I would say at least one aspect, I can't say that it's the full answer, but one aspect would definitely be to be aware and to, you know, put it on the table and talk about it and make sure that we don't assign roles and responsibilities based on additional gender bias.
Thank you, Gabriela. And thank you, Sama, for that question. I will move on to the next one. So nice to see such an active audience with us here today. The next question is from our partners in South Africa, ISS. So Annette is asking if the P5 in the UN Security Council do not have a common point of departure on WPS, where is the next level of leadership to take it up? SG, but accountability cannot forced in cultural environment where women have no place at any table. Who then becomes accountable? Thank you, Annette and Lisel, for that question. Njoki, do you want to answer that question, or do I have another panelist that would like to try and answer that?
I'm just re-looking at the question, but I do see the question is asking if the Security Council doesn't have a common, you know, understanding and push for women, peace and security, what's next? I think from a Secretariat point of view, as you know, I mean, we get our marching orders from the Security Council, and therefore it's very critical for the Security Council to be pushing in the same direction. But we know, I think there are differences in the way the, you know, the various members, the P5, the P3, or even other Security Council members look at the WPS agenda. But I think I would just say what I have seen is helpful is if there is a specific Security Council member who takes the mantle of WPS and pushes WPS within the space of the Security Council. We have seen that work in terms of, for example, when Sweden was sitting in the Security Council, they really pushed the women, peace and security agenda. They made it their agenda. And therefore, everybody sat down and looked at the WPS agenda. There were a lot of missions going to the field missions to look for granulated information on women, peace and security, and bringing it back to the Security Council. And that was useful. And I think that is something we would like to see of, you know, more Security Council members making it a priority. We brief them when they are coming in. We constantly brief the whole Security Council on women, peace and security. So I do see that as important. On the other hand, I also see the fact that the Secretary General has made a proclamation on gender equality, gender parity, including women, peace and security. It also moves the pieces within the leadership of the UN Secretariat and the UN organizations and agencies in terms of how our leadership is looking at that. And I think the third point is also when we have governments who have feminist policies, and they are putting money into the WPS agenda, then we see leadership from that point of view. So I don't think there needs to be, it's one defined way of looking at it, but it is a collective way of looking at the WPS agenda and pushing from the different, from the different sides, both as member states, as donors, as PCCs in the Security Council, as well as the UN Secretariat itself. Over.
Thank you. Let me see if there are any other questions coming in. I think that was all. So before we round off here, I was wondering if you would like all to do a brief statement or summary, something, maybe it can be something positive, a positive experience, or anything that you would like to add before we sum up. Gabriela, I'm going to let you in to start.
Well, this is our opportunity, right?
Exactly.
Well, I would say like this. I think I have already made the statement in a way. I said already, I think this is the time to actually sort of, you know, gather the strength and the courage to actually stand. I mean, we all agree, but we know that it's difficult to actually stand up for gender equality as a value, as a core value in itself that has, you know, both principle value, but also operational value. And I mean, that goes actually, you know, it's not only an idealistic statement, it goes actually quite well with what more and more research does show, that what makes a difference is not, you know, whether we are male or females, but it's actually much more about the values that we hold and the impact that they have. And I think it's exactly the same when we talk about women's participation. It's ultimately about, you know, the underpinning values and why we see it as a core value. So I think that would be my take.
Thank you, Gabriela. Those wise words. Lisa, over to you. Do you have?
Thanks, Maria. I think, I mean, certainly there's sort of 3 points I'd quickly conclude on. One is, I think, a refrain that was mentioned when we, I think, started discussing the WPS agenda in the context of A4P back in 2018, I think, at the annual forum, was this term implementation. So we sort of have a roadmap in terms of what we need to be doing when it comes to implementing WPS that's set out in the declaration. But I think, as we've heard over the last hour or so, a lot of the challenges remain around implementation, political will, accountability, making sure things are financed and making sure it's a shared responsibility. So I think that's important. The second point I'd make is that women, peace and security, the discussions around why it's important, we need to make sure that that's not stovepiped, that these discussions are not just taking place among the so-called experts on women, peace and security, but they are taking place in the broader community across the different components of peace operations who work in different areas, and to increase that wider understanding, I think, of what we're trying to ultimately achieve here. And I think finally, and this goes a little bit to that final question, talking about the role of the Security Council and the P5, I think the point I'd make is engaging civil society. We've seen increased engagement by the council with women's civil society organisations in briefings. And I think this is a really positive development going forward. So the more that efforts are made to listen to women, particularly those in conflicts environments, and ensure that leadership, that those in positions of power hear directly from them and those messages are shared globally, I think is absolutely critical, because then it's much more difficult to ignore their participation and their value, particularly when it comes to political processes, conflict prevention and sustaining peace.
Thank you, Lisa, for those 3 points. Njoki, do you want to end on if you say something?
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. Most of the things I would have said have already been said, but I think it's the value of partnerships, and both traditional and non-traditional partnerships, whereby we're looking at, you know, ensuring that the understanding of the women, peace and security agenda, especially from a peace operations point of view, is well understood, and therefore we can, you know, all pull in the same direction. I think we value partnerships with the think tanks because it is important for that understanding, and the clientele and the partners within the think tanks, and how they can support us, especially from the research dynamics and the evidence generation, so that as we had, implementation is a big challenge, then how can we use that data-driven and evidence-based to make our work better?
Thank you. We do have one more question that's coming from the audience, from our partners in Canada. So I'm going to read that out, as I actually have a couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes more before we round up. So I'm going to shorten the question a little bit, but thank you, Lorraine, for this question. the panel spoke about mission, you spoke about mission transitions, and we are mindful that the key mission mandates are soon to come due. How can member states work with the UN to better ensure that mission mandates apply a more gender-based approach when having those discussions? Please, Njoki.
Yeah, quickly, what we have seen is that the mission mandates have really transitioned. Previously, all the mission mandates, gender is a cross-cutting theme within this, the implementation of this mandate. But now we are seeing mandates which are more nuanced, and that is helpful for the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, because they reference to participation of women in the peace process, in monitoring the ceasefires. They reference to the protection of women in a substantive way, and some of them are even prioritized tasks within the mission. And we have seen three helpful aspects from here, or through three enablers. One is the Security Council's informal experts group, which has concise discussions and analysis on women, peace and security agenda. The Security Council is trying to hold this before mandate renewals, and this is helpful because it helps nuance the mandate with contextual information. The Security Council missions to the mission to the different contexts are also helpful. And they're engaging with women's organizations, engaging with the mission leadership, engaging with the national counterparts also supports this in terms of identifying what is critical and what is key. And so that is something that I would highly recommend that continues. And finally, I think it's the fact that we have a lot of peace processes going on, and also informal peace processes. I think looking at nuancing the participation agenda for DDR, SSR, local conflict resolution mechanisms are things that we are seeing now coming up much more often. And I think this would be helpful to nuance the mandate so that it gives the mission the tools to work on these also processes that lead to the national processes, or that lead to elections, or that are precursor to stabilization, that are precursor to building back and post-conflict and peace building. And these are all, of course, nuanced from a women, peace and security point of view. So I think those are some of the things that I would quickly say.
Thank you, Njoki. And with that, I would like to thank the audience for your active participation, but also to all three of you panelists, Gabriela, Njoki and Lisa, for participating in this webinar, despite the early morning in New York and the late night in Canberra. So thank you very much for interesting discussions, and over to you, Björn.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'll just like to give you some thoughts, as I think you, Gabriela, said that it's eventually about values, and I think that's a really good say. And we were very happy that after 2 years of dialogue within this diverse partnership of the Challenges Forum, we could agree on a strategy that actually highlights as a principle and approach to contribute to more gender-responsive peace operations. That means that we have a basis together, even though we might have different interpretation. And I'm quite sure that this dialogue and discussion has helped us, add alliances and hopefully also to search common ground on the way ahead. I want to say, though, that in dialogue with partners, and especially within the Secretariat, we have been working to look at how can we make our own work, both as a process, but also what we recommend, more, promoting gender equality in WPS in a better way. So I think we've seen the past 5 years how we have more and more gender equal participation, meaningful participation in our annual forums. We're still struggling with, on one side, doing specific WPS or gender equality sessions on the one hand, or the other hand, mainstreaming this. And I don't think we're fully satisfied. So that's one challenge, but we have an action plan within the Secretariat. So we hope we can improve that. But more importantly, I would like to say, because you raised on so many occasions now the issue about leadership, and it also comes up in Lisa's paper, the policy brief. And I think I need to say that as we are a collective multilateral platform, I think we might be able to contribute to part of that leadership work when it comes to promoting WPS and gender equality. As we are about to launch this year, the considerations for mission leadership in UN peace operations. It is a study that has been used since 2010 for the training of SRCs, force commanders, police commissioners. And we are going to ask, we have already asked DPO and other UN departments and agencies to provide feedback on the draft. They've been involved in the start. And of course, Njoki will ask your unit also to give your view on that. But we will launch a study that hopefully will help leaders also work on gender equality and WPS. And I want to highlight the strength of this initiative, because aside from PKSI, where I'm sitting right now, Peacekeeping Stability Operations Institute in the US, the ISS in South Africa, I know they're online, National Defense University in Pakistan, Triple CPA in Egypt, ACMC Australia, USI in India, FBA in Sweden, Gabriela, and DCAF Switzerland, that all contributed to this study. And Lisa has been making special effort now to help us gender mainstream the manual. And we also had Triple CPA and FBA help us to coach the 8 task force co-chair when we started in 2018 to be knowledgeable and know about the gender aspects of leadership. So we sincerely hope, also with input from you and your team and DPO and others, that this could be one of many tools to help us improve in what we do. Having said that, I would like to thank the participants being out there, not being seen, but being very active, chatting questions, because it really made, I think, this more participatory side from the panel. I would also like, of course, to thank Njoki, Gabriela, and Lisa for really good insights and to inspiring us on really working on change. That's why we're all here. I would like to also thank Gabriela and FBA for co-hosting this event, and of course PKSI and Ryan Wolfgram on my side here for volunteering as a webcast location, I think we call it up. So we also have the US participating. And I should say we have PKSI colleagues around the table that have been listening eagerly. So behind that number of participants, we have a lot of other participants. I want to give a special thanks to Maria, that has done a tremendous job in preparing this. Always effective, but also with a lot of depth. So thanks for that, Maria. And Fanny, Fanny in Swedish, who is behind the scenes, both as advising us on gender issues, but being the technical wizard of pulling this off. So thanks to her too. I want to say that we have a coming webinar. I can't tell you exactly when, which will look most probably on changes in global power politics and how this can affect peace operations in the future. I think it's an intriguing and interesting question now when we need to seek consensus, we need to seek shared action, but we know that tensions are increasing. So how will this affect us working on peace operations? I would like to urge all of you that you visit our social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, where you can find more information. And of course, challengesforum.org, where you can find even more, and especially Lisa's excellent paper on WPS and A4P. The YouTube channel, you will find this webinar and also other resources, other good interventions in earlier webinars. So if you missed other webinars, you can always watch our YouTube channel. I would like just to finalize, because I know it's late for you, Lisa. You passed midnight, so you're in the future. The future of better WPS implementation, hopefully. So I would like to welcome you all back, especially the panelists, but also the participants, to join us in the future. And also wish you all a very good day or evening or good night's sleep. So thanks to everyone.